His name is David Ben-Gurion, and this is his biography. I'm Mike Wallace. This is Biography. Our story, David Ben-Gurion. 10 more like him, a rabbi once said, and Israel will be redeemed. He was describing David Green, a young man driven by one consuming ambition, to help create the independent state of Israel, to make it a homeland for his people. When David Green began this lifelong struggle, he assumed the name by which the world would later know him. David Ben-Gurion, David, son of the lion. At the age of 70, David Ben-Gurion, white-maned but tough and vigorous, issued this challenge to the people of Israel. "We will build here an example to the world," he said. "A nation without classes, without discrimination, fulfilling the dreams of our prophets of old." Many men have had their role in history thrust upon them, but David Ben-Gurion sought his role. Even as a child, he clearly saw his destiny. One of 11 children, David Green is born in Plonsk, Poland in 1886. Even as a schoolboy, young David is a rebel. He sees himself as a crusader. To his classmates, he says, "One day I will be the leader of a new Israel." By the time he is 15 years old, he is a tireless organizer for the new Zionist movement, a dedicated group hoping to make a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. In 1906, at the age of 20, David Green migrates to Palestine, now controlled by Turkey. "The spirit of my childhood had triumphed," he later recalls. "I was in Israel, in a Jewish village, and its name was Petach Tikva, the gateway of hope." For almost 5 years, he thrives on working the land in remote farming villages. But in 1910, he joins the staff of the new Zionist labor magazine, Unity. He writes inflammatory editorials against Turkish rule and signs them with a Hebrew name, David Ben-Gurion, David, son of the lion. At the outbreak of World War I, the Turkish government exiles Ben-Gurion as a dangerous agitator. He flees to New York. In 1916, he meets and marries Paula Munweiss, a student nurse, and for 2 years they search for some way to return to Israel. November 1918. At Versailles Palace, the armistice is signed, ending World War I. Turkey, an ally of Germany, loses control of Palestine. The League of Nations then issues a mandate turning the Holy Land over to the British government. The Jews of Palestine are overjoyed. They are confident that this is the first step toward the long-awaited establishment of the State of Israel. As a Zionist leader, a militant advocate for the statehood of Israel, David Ben-Gurion travels around the world. He urges Jews to become pioneers, to settle in what he calls the land of David, land of sacred heritage. The Arab population far outnumbers the Jews in Palestine, and Arab influence is strong. Any proposals of partition by the British are immediately rejected by Arab leaders, who have sworn to drive the Jews out of Palestine. Out of the sun-baked waste, the raiders of al-Husseini, Mufti of Jerusalem, thunder across the borders, bringing death to the unprotected Jewish villages. David Ben-Gurion leads the drive to recruit an underground force, the Haganah. This secret Jewish army will strike back at the Arabs. The cities of Israel become armed camps. For more than a decade, this terror will continue. March 1939. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, seeking to appease the Arabs, issues a white paper, a change in policy which violates the mandate of the League of Nations. The white paper limits all future Jewish immigration to 75,000 persons. After that, not a single Jew is to be admitted to Palestine without Arab approval. The Jewish people now face a greater threat than ever before. The fear spawned by Adolf Hitler. As millions of German Jews are herded into concentration camps, David Ben-Gurion desperately pleads with the British government to open the doors of Palestine. He knows that if he fails, millions of Jews will be exterminated. But his pleas are rejected. The white paper will be enforced. September 1939. As World War II begins, Ben-Gurion issues a statement that for years will serve as a guide for his people. We shall fight the white paper as if there were no war, and the war as if there were no white paper. Ben-Gurion forms a Jewish battalion that goes into action in Italy alongside British units. Spring 1945. After 5 years of fighting, the Axis powers are defeated. Allied forces begin a task unparalleled for heartbreak in the history of man's inhumanity to man. Throughout Europe, living in makeshift camps, the pitiful remnants of the Jewish people wait. They must now seek a way to rebuild their lives. David Ben-Gurion, with renewed vigor, presses his demands on the British government to admit these refugees to Israel. Israel must become an independent state, he declares, to which all Jews can come. Britain adamantly refuses to consider any changes in the white paper. Her policy in the Middle East for many years has been to placate the Arabs, even at the cost of her own prestige. British forces continue to seal off Palestine to the Jews. If we cannot bring our people in legally by day, an underground leader declares, we will bring them in illegally by night. The first crude attempts by the underground to smuggle in Jewish refugees from Europe ends in tragedy. Exodus, caught by a British patrol, is brought into port. The superstructure ripped by shells. The Haganah, however, uses other ships to bring in refugees. They are disguised as merchant freighters, but their cargoes are human beings. The refugees cannot be seen on deck when the ship is in sight of land. They willingly endure the cramped, stifling quarters below. These are small discomforts to the survivors of Dachau and Buchenwald. The journey seems endless. There is sickness and suffering, but there is also courage and faith. The refugees are warned they will probably be detected by the British. And if that happens, they will be interned at camps on Cyprus. Only a day away from Israel, they are spotted by a British plane. The refugees are hurried below decks, the hatches closed and covered. Now it is certain the British have discovered the true identity of the ship, and there is no point in hiding in the suffocating hold. With a courageous show of defiance, they break out the colors of their beloved homeland and sing the ancient songs of their people. In Haifa harbor, for a few hours, they are within sight of Israel. Today, they will be turned away. Today, they will have only this brief glimpse of the promised land. But there will be another time, a tomorrow when they will come home to stay. These people carry with them the words of a traditional prayer. Next year, may we be in Jerusalem. 1948. After 3 years of uncertainty and unrest, the future of Israel is determined by the United Nations. The British mandate over Palestine will end. In Tel Aviv, on the most triumphant day of his life, David Ben-Gurion reads the proclamation which an ancient people have waited to hear for more than 2,000 years. The state of Israel has come into being. In the midst of the celebrating, no one is aware of the throb of bombers winging out of the southeast, out of Egypt. May 15, 1948. The combined armies of the Arab nations, spearheaded by the crack British-trained Arab legions of King Abdullah, attacked the infant nation. This will be a war of extermination, and a momentous victory, boasts Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League. It will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusade. The outnumbered Haganah fights desperately, but within weeks, Jerusalem is encircled and cut off from the rest of Israel by the Arab forces. Ben-Gurion recruits a new fighting force. When he is asked how this ragged army will free Jerusalem, he answers, "I will find a way. I believe in miracles." Israel fights back with determination and daring. First in Jerusalem, then throughout Israel, the Jewish army pushes back the Arab legion. Within 7 months, Ben-Gurion's miracle has been accomplished. Egypt asks for peace, and the fighting ends. Now, says Ben-Gurion, let our people come home. The gates of the camps on Cyprus open. By the thousands, by the tens of thousands, the refugees can now complete their journey to Israel. A state, declares Ben-Gurion, is not created by a declaration. It is the work of months, of years, even generations. The first free election is held. David Ben-Gurion is unanimously elected Prime Minister. Dr. Chaim Weizmann is elected President. Weizmann is a distinguished scientist and diplomat who has worked patiently and quietly to form the new nation. Ben-Gurion is a man of the soil, impetuous. A man, says his friend, who always thinks with his heart. He will be the builder of the State of Israel. On May 11, 1949, Israel is formally admitted to the United Nations. As he enters the Great Hall of the General Assembly, Ambassador Moshe Sharet receives an enthusiastic and heartwarming greeting. Only the Arab countries refuse to recognize the new nation. In 1951, David Ben-Gurion makes an official trip to the United States and is received in Washington by President Truman. He had come here first as an exile. He had returned from time to time for brief visits, asking help to make his dream a reality. And now he comes as Prime Minister of Israel. In New York, he is given a hero's welcome. Then, in 1953, Ben-Gurion stuns Israel by announcing his resignation as Prime Minister. I am tired, he says. I want time to be alone, to think, and to write. No one is indispensable to the state, he declares. Israel will survive without me. Deep in the wasteland that is the Negev desert, the former prime minister begins his retirement in the tiny kibbutz community farm of Shtei Boker. David Ben-Gurion has returned to the soil. (1955). Egypt's new strongman, General Gamal Abdel Nasser, prepares for war against Israel. His Arab legions have been strengthened with massive reinforcements, tanks and guns from Soviet Russia. The general now vows he will drive the Israelis into the sea. In this new crisis, David Ben-Gurion is summoned from his place of retirement and urged to resume his duties as prime minister. At the age of 70, he accepts the challenge. On October 29, 1956, Israeli troops invade Egypt. They overrun the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, and their drive carries them to the Suez Canal. Their sweeping victory shatters the Egyptian army and destroys Nasser's dream of conquest. World opinion, however, is against Israel. The UN censures Ben-Gurion's impulsive action and orders the immediate withdrawal of all Israeli troops. And again, there is an uneasy and impermanent peace in the Middle East. (1958). David Ben-Gurion and the people of Israel celebrate the 10th anniversary of their independence. The pioneers, the immigrants, the young Sabrim, the new generation born in Israel, can take pride in the accomplishments of a decade. The aging lion, the old man, as he is called with deep affection, has given shape and form to all their hopes, all their dreams. David Ben-Gurion's leadership was sometimes challenged during his years as Israel's prime minister. His reaction to such opposition was simple and direct. "I will resign," he would say, and this was usually enough to quiet his critics. Once he was even forced to carry out his threat, but as one official pointed out, he will be back. After all, the lion never leaves its young in danger. Mike Wallace for Biography.